Here we are with Julia Cameron, and I want to get all this right, but Julia has written for the Times and the Independent. She is an active fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. She has done publication communication work for OMF, International. Goodness, I'm leaving all kinds of things out. What haven't you done, Julia Cameron? Thank you for meeting with the Oxford Creative Writing Masterclass. We appreciate it. We're here in Oxford. We have Christ Church College Meadow. We've got some great Oxford scenery behind us. You live here in Oxford.
Yeah.
Tell us about your journey, about how the Lord rescued you, saved you, and then your work and what you do.
Well, I was brought to faith through Billy Graham's ministry, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the 60s. I suppose I was almost 13. And went to Aberdeen University, where I benefited greatly from the Christian Union.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And
now, can I interrupt for a moment? Cameron is a very Scots name.
it is.
Was that your home? Did you went to Aberdeen because of your Scots blood, or was it another reason?
Well, I was born actually in the south of England, but my parents kind of migrated north, and by the time I was 13 we were living in Edinburgh. But I'd set my heart on Aberdeen University. My father was an Aberdonian, and he must have talked to me about it, I think, otherwise I wouldn't have known it was there. So that was where I wanted to go.
Now I'm going to interject here. Did you happen to go to Gilcomston South, and did you know William Still? Was he your pastor?
He was.
Oh,
yes.
my goodness.
I was
what
in.
A saint! What a saint!
I was in Gilcomston, or Gilk as we called it, for 5 years, and before that I was in Edinburgh, in Holyrood Abbey Church, where the pastor was James Phillips.
Okay, sure.
And his name may not be as well known, but his influence was quite remarkable.
Right.
And I've published a little book by him, which has gone into around 20 languages.
Really?
Yes, and I've just republished it here in the UK.
Huh. Goodness. Now, when you say publish it, do you actually operate a publishing company?
Well, I do now. I was with
Dictum Press?
It's Dictum Press.
Dictum Press, right here.
I was with the Lausanne movement. Before the Congress, I was handling its communications. After Cape Town 2010, I was handling its book publishing. Sadly, it closed its book publishing a few months ago. So what I did was to take some of the shorter titles and publish them myself. So that's what I've been doing.
Yeah, that's marvelous. Yeah. And do you distribute internationally?
Yeah. Well, Hendrickson, the US publisher, is still publishing them in the US and has international trade rights. I'm publishing them in the UK and really for non-trade churches, conferences, agencies.
Got it. Excellent. Okay. So you sat under the ministry of William Still.
Yes, and of James Phillips before him.
Wow. That is what a gift. Yes,
it was.
I had a little episode in 1996. I was here with a group of high school students. I think I had about 35 high school students at the time. And we were in Aberdeen, and I wanted to meet William Still. I read some things of him. I heard so much about him. I heard of his influence on Sinclair Ferguson, and Ian Hamilton is a very good friend of mine. And I'll have lunch with David, his son, in London next week. And wanted to meet him. And so I had an address for him. And I stopped a cab. I didn't know where I was. I was at a youth hostel with all these kids. I didn't know where that was in relation to Aberdeen. It's the first time I'd been in Aberdeen. And I showed the cabbie the address. It says William Still. And he looked at it for a moment. He looked at me. He looked back at it and he says, "I cannot take your money. You're only a block away from him." So it was an honest cabbie in Aberdeen. At least there's one. That's good. Yeah. So, goodness, you wrote obituaries for the Times and the Independent. Do you still do some of that?
I still do, though I'm trying to pass on the mantle.
We have these aspiring writers, and she wants to get out of it. Now, listen to that.
I'm still writing a lot,
Yes.
but the reason I wrote obituaries, and I've written 50 or 60, I would say, for the broadsheets, Partly because these people, largely ministers and missionaries, were great evangelists during their lives, so I wanted their death to speak publicly of Christ. That's one reason.
Yeah.
The other reason is the old adage, what will history say? It depends who writes the history. And so I feel that we evangelicals have a responsibility for writing history.
Yes. I agree wholeheartedly.
And from the broadsheets comes the Dictionary of National Biography. I mean, not from the broadsheets, but that's how initial choices are made. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography is the go-to place for historians. And they'll go to the broadsheets and see what obituaries there are, make their choices, and then 4 years after a person has died, they then commission a piece for the Dictionary of National Biography. And I've had the privilege of writing the DNB entries for John Stott, Fred Catherwood, and Tony Wilmot.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was just standing in front of All Souls just 2 days ago in London, thinking about that man, his influence, basic Christianity.
Yes,
John Stott was such a basic Christian apologetic and had so much, and still does, has so much influence and has done so much good. That's one Oxford Creative Writing Masterclass. That's one of 49 other books of John Stott. And we talk a lot about motives for writing. We talk about how do you measure success in writing. John Stott never took a pence of royalty from any of his books. He put it right back into ministry. His honorarium for all the speaking. I heard him speak in Seattle. For all the honorarium of his speaking all over the world, internationally, all of that honorarium went back into ministry.
Yes, he used the verb recycled.
Recycled, isn't that great?
He recycled his royalties back into making other books available. Initially, and then the ministry broadened from there.
Isn't that wonderful? That's magnificent. Martin Luther just had the quincentenary. He never made a dime, much to Katie's chagrin. He never made a dime on any of his books, 47 volumes or whatever it was. All the publishers made the money, and the book printers, but he didn't make any. But then again, Christ must increase, we must decrease. That shouldn't be our driving motive for writing. We shouldn't write if that's our driving motive.
Yes,
for writing.
indeed, and it's not the easiest way to make money anyway.
No.
So if you want to make money, that's not the way to do it.
What did T.S. Eliot say to an aspiring writer at a Harvard address he was at? She came up afterwards and she was all enthusiastic and she said, "I want to be a poet." And he said, "It won't make you happy." Well, Julia, we're gonna cut off our time in front of camera here for now, but we hope to get to talk with you quite a bit more. Thank you so much for meeting with us here in Oxford, your home in Oxford, and thank you for what you write. I do have one more question. Would you tell us why you named your cat Simeon?
Oh, I'd love to tell you that story. And let's go back, let's just rewind slightly to John Stott, because that's where this came from. To understand John Stott, you need to know about two other people. One is Charles Simeon of Cambridge, from whom Stott will say that he learned to preach. That's critical to the John Stott story. And the other person you need to know about is Francis Whitehead. Now, Francis Whitehead was John Stott's secretary for 55 years. And I wrote his story. I wrote Simeon's too. But Francis' story published John Stott's right hand, the untold story of Frances Whitehead. She was a young Christian when John Stott approached her to become his secretary. And how that happened was really quite funny, because she was a young Christian in All Souls, felt that if she wanted to be serious about her faith, she needed to train for overseas mission. So she made an appointment to go and see him and to talk to him about that, and he really showed no enthusiasm, and all he did was make a fatuous suggestion. She was very disappointed with the time she'd had with him. It was Friday evening. She cycled home and tried to put it out of her mind. Well, the following week her phone rang in the BBC. "Hello, John Stott here." Oh, hello. Well, have you thought about it? Thought about what? About becoming my secretary. Oh, I didn't think you were serious. And they were a team of two. They became a team of three with a kind of rolling study assistant years later, but in such a modest way. John Stott lived in 2 rooms, and to get to the sitting room you had to walk through his bedroom, and the study assistant would have a desk in that bedroom. Where did the desk come from? It came from what we call a skip. I don't know what the Americans call them, but you know, where you just throw your rubbish and they rest.
Right. Curbside, yeah.
Yeah, and Frances worked from the drawing room on a dining room chair, not a chair with wheels. Now, she was answering the front door every 15 minutes, and of course getting up for the filing cabinet and so forth. You know, and it wasn't for years. She had a chair with wheels. So these people just lived such modest lives. But you asked about my cat.
Yeah.
Now, the great Simeon of Oxford, as I call him, was given his name by Francis. He's 14 or 15 now. I got him 5 or 6 years ago, and I was visiting Frances, as I often do, and she said, "What are you going to call him?" And I said, "Haven't decided yet." He was already a grown cat, but he was called Percy, and I wanted to change his name. His owner had died. Haven't decided yet. Well, Frances has one register only, and that's authoritative. She said, "Why don't you call him Simeon?" So from that day, he was Simeon. Named after.
It wasn't a mere suggestion. It was
No, it was not a mere suggestion. Named after, of course, Charles Simeon of Cambridge.
What an influential man, Henry Martin and so many others. And the Christian missionary movement in the 19th century was Charles Simeon and Thomas Chalmers. And,
so much. InterVarsity, you'll be familiar with the InterVarsity movement in the States. You can track that right back to Simeon.
Yeah.
I've written a little piece which Whitford Stock actually is publishing next month, I think. Charles Simeon of Cambridge, Silhouettes and Skeletons. A third of it is endnotes. Now, you'd never get away with that normally. But first of all, I published it myself. And then they took it. And so they didn't argue with me. Did they want it or didn't they want it? A third was endnotes. There we are.
That's marvelous, marvelous. Well, too bad we couldn't have met Simeon the Cat, but...
it is, really.
Does anyone have any questions for Julia before we sign off here? Thoughts? We certainly appreciate your time.
Oh, well, it's a pleasure. And I'd love to talk with your young writers about the possibility of their becoming obituarists in time to come.
Absolutely. We're going to go have something to eat.